Jeremiah is interesting because he's never going to go into captivity. There's sort of like a mystery about how he ends up, how he dies. The theory is that he probably was taken to Egypt because some of the before with others, with Abraham, with Noah, but this is specific with a nation. This is really the creation of Israel as a nation. And so this is the marriage. When they came out of Egypt, it's mentioned, you followed me in the wilderness in a land not sown. They left Egypt and went into the desert. And then he says, at that point, Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his harvest. All who ate of it incurred guilt. Disaster came upon them, declares the Lord. So Israel was holy, was consecrated to God, was living at that point, living according to God. They just came out of Egypt. It didn't last too long, their faithfulness, but still at that point. And remember, notice he says, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride. In other words, not like that anymore. The relationship is not like it was. It was a relationship of love when they came out of Egypt, but then there's not that faithfulness anymore. On the part of Israel, God has always been faithful all along, but Israel has not been faithful. This is the story that we have here. When it says, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, it makes me think of a church in the Bible. In the book of Revelation, there is a church that's mentioned. And that it says about this church, we can look in chapter 2 in Revelation, actually. It says something to this church about their love for God. What happened? Seems to me the same thing happened. Huh? It's in Revelation chapter 2. Verses 1 through 4, that's the church in Ephesus, actually, it's the first one mentioned. Church in Ephesus, the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, that's Jesus, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your toil, your patient endurance, how you cannot bear with those who are evil. Wow, pretty good start. You have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false. Okay, that's pretty good. I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake. You have not grown weary. All of that looks really good about this church, but look what follows. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. They're doing all the right things, but apparently there's no love for God. It's interesting, this idea of you can do all the right things, go through the motion, come to church, study the Bible, but there's something about the heart. We've got to reflect on how we feel, how we think about God. What's our relationship with God? Are we close to Him? Do we really trust Him? Everything that makes love real, like in a couple, trust, communication, listening to each other, watching over each other, taking care of each other, all of that. You want to say it's kind of weird, though, because why would you take care of God? Well, it's part of it. You have a relationship with God, a relationship of respect. You communicate with Him. You expect from Him. There's a trust there. And so that's what it's all about here. He says, remember from where you have fallen, repent, and do the works you did at first. And I think that's what happened to Israel here. That's why he says, remember how it was, between you and I. It's not like that anymore. It's far from it, actually. We saw that in Ezekiel. They're really far from God. Even to the point where they are worshiping, actually in the temple, the priests are worshiping Tammuz, the god of the Phoenicians. They're practicing all the sexual sins of the idolatries that were very common All the priests, these are priests, Levites. The kings are corrupt. The priests are corrupt. The prophet, we'll see that mentioned later on. I mean, the whole thing is totally, totally bad in the story of Israel at that point. Now, of course, there's always a remnant. The Bible talks about that. There's always a few. Even Ezekiel talks about it. There's always those, a few, but the majority have fallen away. And it's like that, and actually, when you think about that, it's like that in the Bible. When there's a falling away, it's always going to be the majority. Rarely is the majority right. And quite often the minority is right. So if somebody says, well, everybody thinks like me, I must be right, well, maybe you've got a problem. You know, I think that's very interesting in the Bible here, that this is an interesting thing. Okay, like I said, we're not going to look at everything because I'm going to jump from there in verse 1 and 2 and 3 in chapter 2. Look at down to verse 8. Just to go, we're going to go quickly because it's very long. Huh? So notice, he mentions specifically certain individuals, and these I'd say are the leaders of the people. That's the one that he's looking at here. The priests. Okay, he mentions the priests did not say, "Where's the Lord?" Those who handle the law, these are teachers of the law, did not know me. The shepherds transgressed against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal. I mean, the god of Baal, the Canaanites, and went after things that do not profit. What? This is the people of God? This is the people that God freed from Egypt? They're there now? They're totally fallen into all the idolatrous culture of these people around them? It looks like it. If you may not remember it, but in Ezekiel, in the 34th chapter, there's a whole chapter on that. It's all over Ezekiel. Same period of time, like I said. In fact, Ezekiel is taken into a vision himself, into the temple, to see things of what there's going on. But I'm sure Jeremiah saw it too, for real. Well, in Ezekiel 34, it talks about all the shepherds of Israel. Shepherds, that's the kings, that's the prophets, that's the priests. He says they're all bad. They're all gone. The majority of them. That's incredible. When we say, he says the priest, remember that Jeremiah is a priest. That's interesting. We know that from the beginning of chapter 1. He's a priest, actually, so he's a Levite himself, just like Ezekiel was, in fact. Okay, let's look a little further down. And he says something else here that I want to talk about. There's so many things he talks about. I kind of choose things that I thought were significant in chapter 2 and verse 18. He's speaking to his people again, always, to Judah. And here's what he says, and the leaders in Judah. And he says, now, what do you gain by going to Egypt to drink the waters of the Nile? Or what do you gain by going to Assyria to drink the waters of the Euphrates? What is he talking about? These guys are in Judah. Why would they go to Egypt just to drink the waters of the Nile? Or why would they go to Assyria to drink the waters of the Euphrates? Well, this is figurative language. This is imagery. But they are going to Egypt in a way, and they are going to Assyria because they're going the way of Egypt. They have connections. They do business, and they have religious connections, and they do all the bad things that the Egyptians do, and they do all the bad things the Assyrians do. That's why he says, you go and drink their water. Why don't you just drink the water God has given you in your land? He's giving them a land. He's giving them a land so they can remain faithful and holy, because all around, it's pretty bad. You know, if people today, Christians, studied ancient civilizations, they would say, wow, I'm really glad I'm not living back then. It was horrible. It was horrible to live in the Greco-Roman world. We need to realize that. Civilization, where you can go out of your house and you can be sure nobody's going to just kill you because they want to, just because by pleasure, you know. I'd love to kill you and just kill you. It doesn't happen everywhere. It doesn't. Even today, it doesn't happen everywhere. Civilization, where people are, where people treat each other and they respect life, is rare in human history. It doesn't exist in all of history. You may think, he's very negative with human beings. Yeah, well, the Bible is too. And you study ancient history, it's pretty bad. The Assyrians, the Egyptians, they did crazy things. I say that because there are certain people today, and it's been going on for a while. I don't want to go historically why. There is a sort of admiration, a sort of romanticization of ancient civilizations, of people who are savages. Oh, it's wonderful to be living in the savages. You wouldn't want to be there even 1 minute in some places in the world. Of course, you probably had your head cut off or something like that. But you know, idealizing ancient civilizations and all of that is a mistake. And that's why, one of the reasons why, in the minds of a lot of people, this is the worst place to be. A country that has been Christianized in the past, where we have laws, where life is respected, it's bad. Well, travel a little bit. Go and live in some countries for a few weeks, and you'll come back very quickly to America, or even Europe, where we also have Christianized ways in many ways. But people don't know these things. They don't know their history. They don't know how people live in other places. I've been to Africa. I haven't been all over the world, but I've been a lot of places, and I've read a lot about ancient history, and I can tell you, I thank God every day that I'm here. Especially Tuscola is the best place anyway. But Texas. Somebody said, you come to Texas, you don't go? That's right, that's what happened to me. I don't know if they say it like that. You hurry to come to Texas or something. I don't know what it is. I heard something. What is it? Got here and? As soon as I could. Yet I was like, what, 50? I took my time. Anyway, it's nice. So this is interesting, but I don't want to go like I said. Sorry. I'm coughing, but it's a normal cough. It's not a dangerous one. So don't worry about it. I've had it for a few days, and I don't have a problem. You know, I have no fever, nothing. I wouldn't be here if I was, you know, if I had a doubt. Okay, chapter 2, again, it's a long chapter. Let's look at verse 26, 27. I'm just going through the text. Again, he goes back. You know, there's so much repetition, but he's harping a little bit. As a thief is shamed when caught, so the house of Israel shall be shamed. That's pretty direct language. They, their kings, their officials, their priests, their prophets. What's the problem with them? All these people. Here's what the problem is. They say to a tree, you are my father, and to a stone, you gave me birth. Now, that sounds kind of weird, that people would look at a tree and say, oh, you are my father. You know, I come to you for help. A tree. It's a tree, man. Idolatry is ridiculous. And it brings them to do stupid, foolish things. And here's the thing about that. I just want to mention this. We may think that atheism is better. Give up God, you know, give up your belief in God. It's not better, because there's another kind of foolishness that develops. And here's what it is. These ancient people, when they gave up God and they worshiped trees and stones, that was foolish. But when you are in an atheistic world where you give up God, it's more foolish because you worship yourself. Or you worship a leader. How was Stalin called for many years when he was, you know, the head of the Soviet Union for quite a many years? I don't know, maybe 30 years, 35 years. He was called the good father of the people. Everybody had to have a picture of him in their house, and he was their father. Here, it's a tree that's their father. Stalin is not my father. No political leader is my father. I'm not going to worship a political leader. But when people abandon God, you know what they do? They want to be looked up like God. That's why we need God. That's why we need in the Constitution, that's why it's important that it says that our rights, I can't say the word, inalienable rights, life, liberty, and happiness? Which is it? Huh? Pursuit of happiness, yeah, sorry, that's good, that's right. Come from the Creator. Good. Now, is there any other document in the world, in any other nation? I may be wrong in this, but I think there's no nation under this earth where such a statement is made as a foundation of their organization. None of it, none. The French, about the same time of the American Revolution, they wrote Déclaration des droits de l'homme, Declaration of Human Rights. What did they say about these rights? First, there's nothing like pursuit of happiness. There's not even the right of property. Only right you have is not to be under a king, basically, and to keep your head on your shoulders if you can. Where does your rights come from as a human being? From the state. That means what? From people. Oh, people have the ability to tell you what your rights are? I thought people were sinful. Yes, they are. And so what's the consequence of such a thing? It doesn't work. That's right. Just the fact of recognizing that there's a creator changes the whole perspective and the whole dynamic of how society functions. People don't realize how important it is. But when you look around, you see that it works. Now here, they have abandoned God. God is their father. God is the father of Israel. And now who is their father? A tree. Oh, that's weird. Or this God or that God. And Ezekiel goes into a lot of detail that he doesn't go. He goes in chapter 8, I believe, and several of these chapters, he goes into details of all the different gods. The God's son is worshipped by the Israelites at that time. Where was the God's son worshipped? In Egypt. That's the God Ra. They worshipped the sun. They worshipped everything. They worshipped the Nile, by the way. And the Euphrates was also a god. So that's the reason also they're mentioned, these rivers. But anyway. So, and he says in verse 27, they have turned their back to me and not their face. But in the time of trouble, they say, arise and save us. This is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, you read this stuff, you think, this was written today, wasn't it? I mean, this is the way people are today. They don't want God, but if they're in trouble, maybe we could pray. Maybe we could ask God for help. Once he helps them, they forget him again. That's the way they were. Anyway. Chapter 3. Here's something else I want to read because, like I said, I'm not going through everything, but this is a statement I think is very interesting. And it's a statement about the land. The promised land. Beautiful, we know. It was beautiful, the promised land, the land of Israel. God gave it to them. But look what it says in chapter 3, verse 2. I want to start reading a little bit down. Here's what he says. You have, talking to the people again, but especially the leaders, you have polluted the land. He's not talking about cars and throwing plastic bottles, that kind of pollution. You have polluted the land with your vile whoredom, prostitution. Therefore the showers have been withheld and the spring rain has not come. Well, that's a very interesting passage here. What is their whoredom? Because they have abandoned God and worshiping all these other gods and doing all these crazy things. They're not following the law. They're doing their thing. They're sinning. They're doing all kinds of bad things. And that actually has polluted the land. Today we talk about pollution. Is it spiritual? Is it because of people's behavior that people talk about pollution? No, usually it's about the, whatever it is, all this material stuff. That's where the emphasis is. But isn't it interesting that here, by their behavior, by their immorality, the land is actually polluted. And they lost their land, actually. And not only that, but notice, God says that he stopped sending rain. Oh. You mean God has the power over the clouds? That's shocking. Oh. That's shocking, isn't it? I know. I still believe that God has the power to send rain or to stop the rain if he wants. What did Jesus say? I think it was in Matthew 6. God sends the rain and the sun on the good and the bad. How do we know we have everything we have? It comes from God. Now look at the passage in 1 Kings 8. 1 Kings chapter 8. This is the dedication of the temple by Solomon. And there's something that is mentioned about the rain here and stuff like that. If I can find it. 1 Kings 8. Let's see if it's towards the end. Yeah, it's a long prayer of Solomon, prayer of dedication. It starts in verse 22, but let's continue. Let's go to verse 35. First King. Something about the First King. It was written by Jeremiah according to Jewish tradition. So was Second King. Those two books were written by Jeremiah. That's pretty interesting. Verse 35. Excuse me. 35. Here's part of the prayer of Solomon, which is dedicating the temple. When heaven is set up and there's no rain because they have sinned. Oh, God can stop the rain when people sin. When they have sinned against you, if they pray toward this place and acknowledge your name and turn from their sins when you afflict them, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, you people Israel, when you teach them the good way in which they should walk, and grant rain upon your land, which you have given to your people as an inheritance. If you read this chapter, and there's another one in Chronicles, but if you read this chapter, you get this idea. It looks like the moral and spiritual condition of the people is connected to the physical blessings they enjoy. Is there a connection between the two? Because really, is it just about, morality, spirituality is just about something in the sky, or is God capable of doing something to a people if they don't behave, like sending things, or not sending things, Now, I'm not saying every time there's an earthquake or something I can be sure, but I know this, that it's not going to get better. The weather, the climate, is not going to get better if we get worse. Maybe that's the way to say it. People are dreaming it. They think they can just do what they want, do the wrong thing, sin, be dishonest, lie and kill, and everything will be great. They'll continue to have food, good climate, a good life. No. Sorry, guys. It's not going to work out. It may work out for a while, but there's going to be a point where you're going to start seeing things happening. Because when people turn away from God, well, God turns away from them at some point. So it's dangerous to play with God, and think he's not capable. Anyway, that's what we have here in Jeremiah. I thought it was interesting to look at that. Therefore the showers have been withheld and the spring rain has not come. And we'll finish in chapter 3, verses 15 to 18, because here we have a hope passage, and they're all over the place. This here begins to show us there is a future for Israel. There's a future. And we'll see a few things. Of course, I believe that's connected to Jesus, to the Messiah. All of these hope passages that we find here, like in Ezekiel, have to do with the Messiah. In fact, even a Jewish rabbi will say that today, that it's all about the Messiah, because they don't believe Jesus is the Messiah at all. But I'm talking about the regular Orthodox Jews. But here's the passage. He says, it's about the future. I will give you shepherds after my own heart who will feed you with knowledge and understanding. Wow, what a change. Well, that's going to be nice. When you have multiplied and been fruitful in the land in those days, declares the Lord, they shall no more say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord, it shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed. It shall not be made again. So you won't even need the ark of the covenant? Is there going to be such a change? Yeah, because there's got to be a change of covenant. Because the new covenant, you don't need the ark of the covenant. You don't need that. You don't need that tabernacle. You don't need those priests anymore. Yeah, it's a new covenant because that one was not perfect. It's a new covenant. Well, what is it? At that time, Jerusalem shall be called the throne of the Lord. Jerusalem changes its name. In Hebrew, if you read it shall be called the throne of the Lord. That's a name. That's a name. It could have been put as a name, italics, to understand that he's changing the name. Just like Ezekiel changes the name of the city also to something else. When you change a name in the Bible, that means a lot. Anyway, it's the Jerusalem now is called the throne of the Lord. And that goes back to Revelation also, because now the city, you don't need even a temple. You don't need even anything like that, because why? God is the one. He's the one. You don't need a temple. Anyway, all nations shall gather to it. Oh, when the future comes, it'll concern not just Israel, but all the Gentiles, all the nations. Wow. All the nations shall gather to it, and to the presence of the Lord in Jerusalem. You notice that. He's present, the Lord there. They shall no more stubbornly follow their own evil heart. In those days the house of Judah shall join the house of Israel, and together they shall come from the land of the north to the land that I gave your fathers for a heritage. He's talking here about the reunification of the lost tribes of Israel and Judah. They were in captivity. They're going to be one. When does that happen? Well, we're going to read later. I'm not going to go into it today. In Jeremiah 31, he says that's when the new covenant is made. I will make a new covenant with Judah and Israel. And it's a different covenant. It's a covenant based on the work of the Messiah, on forgiveness. I will forgive their sins. It's not a covenant based on the animal sacrifices and all of that. And just coincidentally, that passage in Jeremiah 31 is quoted by Hebrews completely, entirely in Hebrews 8 and applied to the work of Christ. It is done. That covenant with Israel is done. God has made it. God has made it. Of course, the rabbis say, no. No, it has not made that covenant. So the covenant we live, the new covenant that we live in through Jesus Christ, is a covenant God made with Israel. We are now, as Gentiles, nations, Gentiles, none of us is Jew, I suppose, but we are now part of Israel, somehow. And it's not a physical thing, but God has grafted us, Paul says in Romans 11, to Israel, to the patriarchs, to the promises. So now we are inheritant. We inherit too. We also inherit all the blessings that are given to Abraham, we inherit too. In fact, Paul says in Galatians 3, verse 28, you are also now the seed of Abraham. Well, it's amazing. But that's very important to understand, that's what we're talking about here. I often say that, probably it's finished now, but I often say that we got to be very careful, because here's the problem. For a long time, what people have been preaching is that the new covenant is made with the church. The church is made up of Gentiles. So Israelites are forgotten. No, not what the Bible teaches. Jesus was a Jew, the apostles were Jewish. When he made the covenant and when he gave the Lord's Supper, it was all a Jewish thing. During the Passover, a Jewish feast. So it's all done with Israel, but we are benefiting from that now. So a Jew today, who is a descendant of Abraham, what does he need to do? He needs to put his trust in Jesus and convert to the Messiah, or accept to the Messiah. He doesn't have to convert to Christianity, like we might think. He has to follow Jesus, his Messiah, and live like his Messiah wants him to. That's where the dilemma is. So it's an interesting thing, because it helps us understand these prophets better, I think, when we understand what's going on with Jesus, a Jew, his apostles, this new covenant that we're in now. It's the same that Jeremiah talks about. So we'll continue. We did only 2 and 3, but that's enough for today. It's even